Sweet. Thank you. Well, everyone, thank you so much for uh, jumping on to view my talk today. I'm really excited to speak about this. I think this is a really great topic to talk about because it's something I find is honestly been one of the most revealing things to me about cybersecurity and our industry, honestly. As people kind of file in here, I guess what I want to start out with here is just want to say thanks to VetSecCon for allowing me to speak. I spoke last year at a great time, and I think this organization is really important, and it's something that I feel gives a lot of people really great advice and really great insight into the cybersecurity industry and how to kind of transition from the military into the cybersecurity and especially the private cybersecurity world, which is very different. And there's a lot of, I guess I'd say, some really interesting challenges that happen there. And not all of them are definitely on any individual's part. Most of them are actually as a result of the companies and kind of the industry that we're in. So today, this talk is really just to discuss what does hiring an analyst look like, especially, a lot of entry-level analysts. What does it look like on my end when I was a hiring manager? And also, what does it look like for the analysts? And, why are some of the things that people ask about, why is my resume getting rejected all the time? Why am I not being hired, or even though there's a bunch of jobs out there? We're going to try to kind of answer those questions. This isn't really necessarily going to be a guide to how do you get hired for your first security job. There will be tips for it, but it is going to be more of a, I guess, transparent view of what does a hiring manager look for, and then what is the hiring manager doing on the back end that doesn't really get talked about, I feel like, in a lot of spaces. So I think we'll kind of just start off here with talk about who am I. So I'm a former security engineer and incident responder. I then moved into an incident response role, a full-time incident response role, where I was then promoted up to the MDR director for a cybersecurity vendor. Currently, I'm a solutions architect at another cybersecurity vendor where I do a ton of time telling people, hey, this is how you should staff, and this is kind of what resourcing you need to be able to basically run your cybersecurity program. So I have a lot of experience around the resourcing aspect, and I also have a lot of experience around not just what did my company look for from a hiring standpoint, but also what do other companies look for and what are some of the challenges that they feel. And I'm just checking here. Awesome. Just making sure that things are going okay there from a presentation standpoint. I am also a cat owner, as you guys can see. So let's jump into the presentation here. What are we really talking about here? Now, I kind of went over that in the introduction, but I want to be clear. There is a ton of advice out there for people who want to be hired as security analysts, but I want to level set some expectations here, and this goes for just about any job out there that you're applying to. Hiring for entry-level analysts, especially in cybersecurity, is pretty difficult for managers, and there's a number of reasons for that we'll talk about. The other thing is that getting hired for entry-level analyst positions is really, really hard for people. And this is not just, it's a very unique aspect of the cybersecurity industry. I've had a lot of conversations with other managers about this, and it's just, there is some unique challenges and variables that have gone into, what happens when you try to hire someone for a SOC analyst position that can really make this a difficult place to not only hire for, but also to get hired into. Honestly, in my opinion, it's the most difficult step for anyone trying to do cybersecurity. Once you get that first cybersecurity job, a lot of it's a lot easier. And we'll talk about why that is. But that first one is so difficult. And I know a lot of people, I've interviewed a lot of people who have been looking for a long time and they just can't get into it. And I'm going to talk about why that is. I have hired a number of people without technical experience into a SOC that I ran. I have hired numerous veterans, and there's actually a lot of overlap with why I hired those veterans as opposed to people who were not, that I will kind of talk about in this presentation too, that I think can be really helpful for anyone listening to this presentation. And like I said, this is less of a guide, and it's just more of a transparent look into how talent is evaluated and what the hiring manager is trying to do when they're interviewing and when they're going through hiring for a SOC analyst. So let's talk about these challenges. I alluded to them a little bit earlier in the presentation, but really there's a number of different challenges here. I'm not going to read from the slide on this. I'm just going to kind of talk about my experience here. The issue with hiring for entry-level analysts for just about any company out there is there's a lot of applications, but it is very difficult to be able to effectively evaluate candidates, not only from resumes, but also during interviews. And there's a couple of reasons for that. I'm going to set the scene as if, we were hiring for a help desk position. I don't know how many of you have ever worked help desk or know anything about the help desk industry, but generally there are people who are just entering into the IT industry who have some certifications and things like that, and they're trying to do help desk basically, and to get their foot in the door, which is very similar to what cybersecurity analysts do, and that's what I see a lot of cybersecurity analysts come in as. Alternatively, they have a lot of people who have a lot of help desk experience, 5-10 years of help desk experience trying to get another help desk job. They want better benefits. They want to work for a different company. They want a different environment. There is none of that in the cybersecurity world. I reviewed thousands of resumes, and the number of security analysts that want to move from security analyst to security analyst position, especially a L1 or to an L2 position, I can count on one hand. It's just incredibly rare. So the issue that happens is hiring managers, generally when they're hiring for security analysts, they have certain conditions that they have to meet. One, they have to make sure that their operational concerns are going to be basically filled, because that's what the SOC is. It's an operational organization. You have to make sure the job gets done. But two, they generally have very high turnover rates, and it's not just because the SOC is a bad SOC or anything like that. Even at great companies with great pay and great benefits, you're going to get people leaving out of that SOC every 2 years, and a lot of times after 1 year, because that's all it takes generally to move up into an engineering position or into a more specialized field that generally pays more and is seen as a little bit more prestigious in the industry. Right or not, I don't necessarily think it is correct that it's more prestigious, but it does happen. The other issue is that SOCs, from a budgetary standpoint, do not have a ton of budget from a personnel standpoint. You know how I'm talking about how it's seen as low prestige in the cybersecurity industry? Employers see this as, for whatever reason, low skill work, when in reality, a lot of the SOC work, the detection response that goes into this, is incredibly varied work where you have a lot of different experiences in it. And in all honesty, it's undervalued by a lot of employers. So what happens is you can't just hire one person in a SOC. You can't hire unicorns. You don't go looking for unicorns all the times. So what happens is you kind of get into the spot where you don't have enough budget to hire some of these really great people who want to be engineers, and they're not going to apply to you anyway because they want to be engineers, not analysts. You're not going to be able to look at things like, oh, this person has done these analyst jobs beforehand, and they're just looking for a different environment, because people don't just apply for the same analyst positions. And then finally, you still have to have that job getting done, and there's an operational concern that's at the forefront of your mind. How can I make sure the job gets done, and how can I make sure that people doing this are going to be able to do their job? So the real thing that happens generally, and this is when I've talked to different managers and things like that, what I talk to them about is you basically hiring on potential. It's really hard to hire just on technical skill. You can do that, but a lot of times people are hiring on potential. So how do you solve for this as a manager? There is no right answer to this, and I'll just talk about my experience a little bit and what I've heard from other managers. But there's a couple ways to do this. One, you hire on a purely technical basis. This is where you throw a bunch of questions at your analysts or your candidates and say, hey, do you know what port ping is on? Which, you try to throw out questions that are going to stump them. I think that's a mistake, but there's a lot of that happens in this industry. Other managers will just hire for experience. I will tell you that the managers that are trying to hire based on experience have a very hard time hiring. I have worked with a number of them across a number of different industries at this point, and the managers that I am speaking to that say, hey, I'm not going to talk to anyone with less than 3 years of analyst experience, they are not hiring people, or at least when they are, it's very, very rarely. It's just hard to hire people when they have that former experience for a lot of what these people want to do. My solution, and what I talked to a lot of managers on, is my solution when hiring entry-level analysts was I determined basically the qualities that I look for in a team, and then I hire on potential. All of this is really subjective, but you have to get over those challenges that I basically talked about a slide ago. And there's only really a few ways to do that in a lot of cases. Some of the ways to do this that managers will do is they'll use staffing agencies. They'll do short-term contracts. That comes with their own sets of problems. a lot of times you get really poor work out of it. Or they'll try to do the try before you buy model, where you can do contracts, or you'll basically have people do a bunch of take-home tests, and they're not necessarily technical ones, but they'll do take-home tests. There's some success with that, but there's a lot of you basically really reduce your candidate pool to whoever wants to play along with the, hey, take home some work and do a bunch of this stuff to basically prove that you can be an analyst. So I want to preface the rest of this presentation on another thing here, and that is really a comment on hiring style. Hiring is incredibly subjective. Everyone has people they hire for reasons that aren't obvious. As much as this industry has tried to push bias out of the hiring process, it happens all the time. Many times managers will hire just on a gut feeling, and that's just the way it is. It's a very subjective thing. And so a lot of times what I will say is, we can go through this entire presentation and you can still be kind of sitting there saying, hey, I met all the requirements. I was, great interviews, all these things, and I still didn't get hired. And what I will say to you is sometimes it's not your fault. A lot of times the manager is just going to make a decision and going to make a gut feeling. And so I guess what I want to say there is all of this is generalizations, and you can't really just point out to your specific experiences and say, hey, this is exactly what happened here, because a lot of times you're probably a great candidate. You just didn't get hired for whatever reason. The other thing I will say, and this does come up a lot, especially as we get more eyes on the cybersecurity teams and what they're doing, is most companies have multiple stakeholders during the hiring process. And that doesn't just necessarily mean they have a yes or no vote, but it does mean that sometimes a manager who they interview someone, they don't like them, but the rest of the team does, or your boss likes them, you're still going to hire that person just because, you know what, I don't want to be wrong on this. If I hire the person that I like better and they're not a good fit, I'm going to be blamed for that. Whereas if I hire the person that everyone said they're the best candidate and they're not a good fit, there's no risk to me. Exact opposite can happen. You can be the one who loves a person and then the rest of the team doesn't like them, and effectively you're sticking your neck out there. So I just want to also preface that here. There's a lot of subjectivity in this process. And when you're hiring people and when you're interviewing, you have to understand that. So it's my advice to anyone who is struggling this or has felt the sting before, you got to keep applying on this stuff. Anyway, so how did I hire? We talked a little bit about what I was looking for when I was hiring, but I want to talk about how I actually hired, what that process looks like, because I think a lot of people have never really talked to anyone that's really walked them through how they hire people. How do they go from the application stage all the way to the, hey, you're hired stage with candidates? So the first thing you have to do is you build a pipeline. And this does not necessarily mean going out there and advertising your position. Doesn't mean going out there and posting on Twitter, hey, I've got a bunch of positions open, come apply to this. That's part of it. But really what you're doing is you're trying to basically use numbers to quantify candidates, effectively what it is. So I rejected about 50% of initial applications. And I'm not going to, this is not necessarily the truth, but there is something to be said that there's a joke out there where the manager basically takes half the resumes and says, I don't want to hire anyone who's unlucky. That's not what happens. But what does happen is you do look for basically anything that's going to be a red flag or anything that is going to be someone who, just doesn't fit from a candidate standpoint. That stuff is like anyone who doesn't fit HR requirements, citizenship, they are across the United States and they're not open to relocation. Someone who had no relevant experience or interest, someone who was a person who was like in oil, someone who worked in an oil field and was trying to transition into cybersecurity, but they had done those certifications. I saw nothing about it. It looked like a resume that wasn't even right for the job. The other one, and this one I think is really important for potential candidates, is poorly worded initial ingredients. Whenever you apply to some companies, they're going to have a, hey, how did you find us? Hey, do you want to say something to your hiring manager? A lot of times people would get filtered out if they would basically have a initial ingredient that was going to show them obviously as not a great person to work with. Or potentially not a great person to work with from my team. So for example, if someone came in there and said, hey, I don't really want a cybersecurity analyst job, but I went to school for it and everyone says it's a great industry to get into, but I don't really have any interests. You know, I would actually see comments like that, which was really rough sometimes to see that. But I also saw a lot of that, and that was one of those things that would get people rejected for them. So a lot of times what I will tell people whenever you're applying for positions here is try to reduce the amount of things that will make people reject you as opposed to necessarily hire you. It gets you past that initial filter a lot easier. The other things that would happen, resumes that were really poorly formatted, stuff where I was not able to read or understand what they had done. Ones where there was obviously something that had gone wrong from basically an uploading standpoint and it was corrupted. There was a large number of those. So honestly, the initial part of basically getting into the first interview was you just had to meet some of the requirements, or you just had to be someone who didn't have anything that was necessarily going to say, hey, no, I cannot hire you for X reason. With that said, once you've built that pipeline, once you've got about 50% of those initial applications rejected, you can then start looking at the next part of it, which is basically your first interviews, and then your second interviews and your third interviews. And really, when you're doing your first round interviews, you're thinking about your second and third and who you're going to hire. So from a hiring manager standpoint, for me, the biggest thing for me was a willingness to learn. Now, I hired very differently than a lot of managers, and I had basically carte blanche for my leadership to say, hey, hire people who you think are going to be good fits for the team and who are going to be able to learn and want to do cybersecurity. So that's what we did. So the first thing that I did was I basically looked for anyone who had a interest in the subject, or was really passionate about cybersecurity. And it doesn't necessarily mean they were going home and doing home labs or were doing search on their own time, but it was stuff like, hey, I'd done some research into these things, or hey, in their initial greeting, they talked about how they wanted to move into cybersecurity threat intelligence or incident response. It was something that showed, hey, they kind of had a plan, they kind of had thoughts, they'd done some research into the career field. The other thing that I will tell you is past work experience in IT or intelligence helped a ton. Remember how I said that no one when they're applying to these entry-level SOC analyst jobs really have much experience from a SOC analyst standpoint? One of the things that can help hiring managers is seeing past IT experience or intelligence experience, or really any other past job experience that at least shows some technical aptitude that you basically said, hey, did you work in computers? I interviewed people who worked at Best Buy as on Geek Squad, and that was, that's enough for me sometimes. So really what I guess I would tell people is that those two aspects are really important to me, not necessarily to every hiring manager, but it was how I would basically go in and start ranking people as, okay, who do I think is going to have the potential to end up on the team? The first interview is a weed out. That's really what those are. It's basically trying to cut another 50% of the initial applications that you talk about. Effectively, I'm looking for a reason to say no. And it's kind of the same things. It would be the people who didn't really have an interest in the career field. It was people who were maybe not great fits from a candidacy standpoint for my company. They were looking for someone for a place that wasn't necessarily a startup, right? They were looking for a place that they really wanted to have. They really wanted to have great processes in place and things like that. Or it was someone who was maybe really new to the entire idea of how do I do cybersecurity, and where we were at that point, at least the first time I was hiring people, we weren't at that place. Now, a lot of times what I would say is the reasons people weed people out is more around, I'd say that initial reason around basically people aren't having an actual interest in the career field. It doesn't mean that you can't be in the career field because you want to get paid money, but a lot of times it would be things like, hey, I'm just applying for this job because I think I've got the experience, but I don't really want to do cyber. I want to go into networking or something like that. It's one of the things about the cybersecurity industry where you're able to basically say, hey, there's a lot of people really interested in cybersecurity, so you can kind of select for that. The other thing that I will say is generally, I move 25% of people forward, or really about 50% of the people who did the first interview, 25% of the people who initially applied. The other thing I will say, though, is that the interviewing skills for the people that you're talking to are really important. For me, a little less so. I didn't necessarily select on people who are great from an interviewing standpoint. Everyone gets really nervous, and that's just how it is when you interview. But I know a lot of hiring managers really, really, really think that confidence in interviews is a huge deal. That's hard to do. It's really hard to say, hey, just be confident in an from the interview standpoint. And a lot of the best interviewers that I know will make people feel confident when they're interviewing them. But it is something to note that, hey, if there is a way that you're able to kind of feel a little bit more calm, or that you talk really quickly, like I do when I present, but if you talk really quickly when in an interview, or you don't necessarily have great answers for some of the common questions, that is something that you can kind of prepare for and fix. You don't necessarily have to know the answer to the questions there, but if someone says, hey, tell me about your background. One of the things that I saw a couple of candidates do, and I've seen candidates do, is they write down word for word that exact answer of tell me about your background, and they practice it until they're able to speak to it really naturally. So that's something that you can do, but it is something that I know a lot of people hire for. I never necessarily was a huge believer in, hey, how confident is someone in that first interview? Because that's really hard. You're meeting someone for the first time. The other thing I will say, though, is that being personable might not matter, but communicating effectively does. And this is something that you will notice. Some of the most awkward interviews that I've been on where I was a candidate was where basically I would say something and the hiring manager would ask me, what did you mean by that? And then you have to go back and explain the same answer to the question. And if that happens several times, it's going to make it so that you seem less personable and less effective as a communicator than you really are. So once again, practice your answers to some of these things that you think you might be asked, or at least you have been asked in the past. That's the killer for people, is that lack of confidence and that lack of communicating effectively. The other aspect that I will say is showing interest in questions will make up for a lot. One of the things that one of the most memorable interviews that I had where I was interviewing someone was they would ask me follow-up questions on the questions that I was asking. It was, basically asking the manager, hey, what do you think about my answer? What do you think about, you asked me, what do you think is the most important part of cybersecurity for whatever reason? Okay, Mr. Hiring Manager or Mrs. Hiring Manager, tell me what you think. And that's a way that you can start a conversation. A lot of times what you will hear from recruiters and from other hiring managers and from people in the industry will say, it's more of a conversation. And that's a great way to turn it into one, is to ask that question reflexively back to the person who's interviewing you. So just want to call that out there. It's a great way that even if you are a really nervous person when you're interviewing, it's a great way to make up for that, is you just remember, hey, I'm going to ask them what they think, and then I can build off of that answer. So with that in mind, I wanted to talk a little bit about how I hired, but I will say that the InfoSec hiring environment is kind of really rough, and it's because of a lot of the hiring manager issues and challenges that I talked about earlier, but also because I think we haven't really done a good job of explaining how do you actually go into these interviews and talk to people about your past experience where it might not be cybersecurity related. And then a lot of the hiring managers really just want to talk about cybersecurity stuff. And so you get this big disconnect. So that's kind of this is what the InfoSec hiring environment is, especially right now. There's a lot of people in the job market, unfortunately. So I would also say that it's a really hard time to get hired right now. With that in mind, how can you get hired? I gave you a few tips about interviewing beforehand, but I want to talk a little bit more in depth about how you can actually structure your job search, and so that you can get past not only that initial phase, but also the first couple interviews and get really down to that, hey, how do I get hired stage? So the first thing I will say is, one, remember how I talked about that when you're looking at resumes, the first 50% for me were basically weed out things. The best way to go about getting a job in this industry is determine what job you actually want. And that means understanding the companies that you're applying for. Now, are you just trying to get into cyber? You're just trying to get in. It's an entry-level position, and you've got something on your resume that's going to show someone that you have some skill sets, or you've got the ability or got some passion or interest in the field. You can probably just go out there and spray and pay. You can go out there and throw your resume at just about any job, and someone will probably talk to you at that point. And then it's up to you from an interviewing standpoint, but you'll hear back. However, if you're someone who has not basically got any of that stuff on their resume, you're going to want to look for companies that are probably going to speak about being trained up. And you can look for very specific things in job postings. One, entry level, no experience required, or both honestly kind of bad ones at this point. But the ones you can see are ones that talk about trainability, the ones that talk about we really want someone with a passion in this field, the ones that say, hey, you don't have to have any cybersecurity experience or IT experience. We just want someone who is interested in getting into the field. And there's a couple of companies out there like that, but you can search for those. And that might be a great place where if you can show, hey, you know what, I don't have certifications or I don't have previous job experience, but I do have an interest and I can talk about the blog that I've been writing, or I can talk about how I'm active on Twitter. Those are places that will probably interview you. The other thing is align your goals with a company that basically you're applying for. One of the hardest things for me was talking to people who are great candidates who really wanted to be at a company that had a much more stable foundation and wanted to move into a really specific team that was not part of what we did. So it's because what happens then is basically if I hire you, I know that in probably a year, you're going to leave for another company. And that's really hard for me to basically hire off the bat. I know that the analysts I'm going to hire are going to leave probably, but I cannot necessarily in good conscience hire you for a year and then know you're going to want to move to some other company for that when there's someone who wants to work for me and then wants to move into something that my company also does. It's just basically kind of that weed out aspect there. So understand what you're looking for and understand what the goals that your company is trying to also get out of it. So if that company wants to train you up and then have you move up forward and maybe wants to move you into management at some point, see, hey, is that really light up with your career progression? The other things that I will say is don't be afraid about failing the first interview. I really recommend people go out there and just apply to a lot of different jobs, at least at the start. Try to get as many interviews as possible. You don't have to be great at interviewing. In fact, the best way to become great at interviewing is failing at them, is basically going in, not having any idea of how you're going to answer certain questions, and then coming back out with some notes taken about this is what they asked me, this is how I could answer better. The manager didn't really like how I answered this one. I'm going to change my answer up. It's something that you can get really good at, and it's something that you can do really, really quickly as long as you're getting those first interviews. So if you're maybe not in the position to get into cyber right now, but at least you want to start doing some stuff and getting prepared for it, you can do things like that. You can also ask people who are in cyber if they would mock interview you. I'm always happy to mock interview people. I think it's a really great way to basically get some skills in doing interviews and getting hired. So I'll really recommend that as well. It's a great way to practice it with no stakes. Don't become a Taliban who does not like their office culture, I guess is what I would like to also say on this one here. It's a really important aspect to this job is understanding the company that you're going to go into. The other thing, resume tips. Do not put OER bullets. I saw a couple of those when I was interviewing people. And I guess what I would tell you on that is hiring managers don't necessarily really like them. I think they're really great to do to show achievements, but a lot of time your resume is really there to talk about what impact you make and to show how well you work with a team. So tell a story with your resume. Provide basically try to tailor what your past jobs that you've done, tailor them for the current job that you're applying for. So let's say that you have done jobs in logistics in the past and you want to move into cybersecurity. So what you can do is you can talk about how you had to handle large organizational challenges and you've had to work with a lot of different people and communicate with a lot of different people about topics that they don't have any idea about, but you've had to translate for them. 100% translatable from into a security job there. But I guess what I would not say is I did logistics and now I'm looking for a cybersecurity job. That's what you want to avoid. So there's a big difference between the idea of led a team of 5 people and led a team of 5 people who are able to achieve a 30% improvement in overall capability during my time. Those are the types of resume bullets that I look for, not that first one. Education versus search versus experience. This is one that I think there's a lot of conversation on, and it's something that I hear a lot of people ask about. I'm in a couple of groups on Facebook where I talk to a lot of people about wanting to move into the cybersecurity field, and this is the most contentious topic in the world, and it's really funny because the right answer is really it's a balance. experience for SOC jobs makes up for a ton of just about anything, especially for entry level stuff. But that does fall off. If you have 20 years of SOC experience and you're still applying for SOC jobs, that's great. The question that a lot of hiring managers are going to ask you is, why do you want to work for my SOC as opposed to another one? And that's what's going to throw up red flags for them. But it's okay. It's okay to do that. You just have to be able to say, hey, I really like your company. But I will say that there's never too much experience, but having a little bit goes a long ways. Flip side, education plus certs plus having some work history is a really golden combo. No one will ever question you if you have 10 years of experience, 5 certs, and then you've also got a degree in cybersecurity. You are someone who is fit for the industry. You will probably be able to get into the industry just fine. Most people that I talk to don't have that, don't have the time for that, nor do they have the money to pay for all the certs and all the education. And maybe they're just trying to get a job so that they can have work history to apply for the places that say entry level, but they also require 3 years of experience. So the other part of this that I will say is I hear a lot of people talk about how get as many certs as you can, and that's going to get you hired. Most people have certs out there. Most of the people that I interviewed, most of the resumes that I saw, even resumes with people who were clearly not interested in the industry and they were just kind of trying to get into IT or a work from home job. Most people had like a TIA A+ cert and a security plus cert. Those are pretty ubiquitous out there. So having them was never the tipping point for a hiring decision. Not having them without experience and without education would get you denied though. So it's just the bar is not super high. I don't necessarily know if I would hire someone who had 12 different certs plus their CISP over someone who didn't have any and a little bit of work experience. It really just kind of depends on the candidate there. And I would not recommend that you spend thousands of dollars on certs on your own dime. I really believe that's something that employers will definitely pay for. So if you can get free certs out there, you can provide some way for people to show that you have an interest in the industry without having to pay for them. I think that's a great way. Boot camps. Now, this is a big topic, and this is something I think is really important for veterans. I was contacted by a number of boot camps that would basically accept GI Bill money, and they'd say, hey, we'll train you to get into the cybersecurity industry and we'll guarantee your job. So there's probably a lot of boot camps out there that are good at that. There are a lot of scams out there, and it's really prevalent in the industry, and there's a lot of them that are targeting veterans. And in fact, this topic is kind of why I'm doing the speech in the first place. Be really selective if you're going to do a boot camp and try to get into cyber out of them. There's probably better ways to do it. I don't want you guys to lose GI Bills. And I saw a couple of candidates that happened, and it was really rough. Now, some are great out there, and they will give you at least that point in your resume that shows that you're interested in the industry. But there's a lot of candidates out there that have gone through boot camps that are not great candidates. And then after the hiring managers have interviewed a couple of them, what's going to happen is they're going to go back to you and see that you attended the same boot camp, and that can actually really negatively affect you. So I guess what I would say is be really careful with those. And then the other fact is that they sell on basically, we're going to teach you how to do the job. The colleges out there, they won't teach you how to do the job. The certs out there won't teach you how to do the job. But in all honesty, when I'm hiring for a SOC analyst, being able to do the job is relatively easy to train out there. It's something that when I'm hiring someone, I know that I'm going to have to train them to at least do the job the way that I want to. It never really played into my hiring decision if I thought, can they do the job day one? Because I know I'm going to have to teach them how to do the job the way that I want them to. So be really careful about boot camps. If you've done one, if you've done one, that's great. It shows at least have some passion for the industry, but be really careful. Don't overpay for them, and don't necessarily fall for the idea that they're just going to get you straight into the industry. With all this said, all this stuff gets you in the door. I don't think that any of these credentials are going to basically get you hired. They're going to get you that interview. They're going to get you that first interview. They might get you a second interview if you're really nervous or you're not really doing well on that first interview. They might move you forward past that, but it's going to be really hard to get hired if you have not interviewed well and if you don't have some passion, if you don't have some interest in the industry, basically. The other thing is understand there will always be someone with better or more certs, education, or experience. There are people out there who their entire lives practicing for certifications and giving certifications, and a lot of times they end up at the same positions as people who don't have a ton of them. So just don't over-index. Don't spend a bunch of money out of pocket. I've seen that advice elsewhere. I would just recommend not to do so. Interview skill sets. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. We've talked a lot about this, but basically, you just want to have some sort of interest. Have a career plan for the field. When someone says, "Hey, what do you want to be doing in 5 years?" Tell them. Even if you don't know, just tell them, "Hey, I want to be doing incident response." Or tell them, as a lot of people I talk to, tell them you want to be doing red teaming. It's a really common thing, and it's okay to at least just have some sort of idea. At least tell them what you're interested in. Have questions prepped. This was one of my biggest things that when I was interviewing people is they didn't have any questions. I'd get done and say, "Hey, what questions do you have for me?" And they'd say, "No, I don't really have any." And while they might not have, I would just really recommend that you write down 3 questions at the start, before any interview that you can use throughout any other interview, and just throw them out there. It lets the conversation kind of flow, and it lets the person that you're talking to feel a little bit more at ease with you because it shows that you're interested in the job. Technical interview tips. I'm going to go through this really quick too. I've talked a little bit about this as well, but basically, these are crapshoots. These are really, really hard to do. Some people are really great at technical interviews. I am famously bad at technical interviews. I have talked to my friends about how I'm really, really bad at them. The best thing to be able to get some sort of experience this, or if you're stressing about this, is to get some experience with these technical interviews. Apply for companies, go through their technical interview process, and you're going to have an idea of what other companies will ask you. The other thing is be okay with being wrong. Take a shot at an answer and then say, "But I'm not quite sure about that. What can you tell me is the exact right answer on those things?" The good technical interviews will ask you about stories or letting you think logically, talk to you, basically go through a scenario with you. Bad ones will ask you questions like what port is ping on. So if they're asking you basically trivia questions, that's a bad technical interview. It's really hard to process that. Maybe you'll know the answer, maybe you won't. If you do, great. If not, don't beat yourself up too much, and don't over prep for it. Most managers at this point, I think, understand you don't ask for trivia questions, and the ones you do, it should inform you a little bit about what it's probably going to be like to work with them. Final thoughts. I guess this one here it's really important to understand this for candidates who are just trying to get in. You are going to be rejected from jobs that you're qualified for and interview well at. That's just what happened. A lot of managers and stakeholders make gut calls. There's only so much that you can control as a candidate, but I want to make sure that people understand that if you do this, if you go through, you apply the advice that you get in VetSec and in their Discord, and you also go through and maybe take some of my advice from this talk, you will get a job somewhere. You will be able to break in, but understand on the flip side that it might take a little bit of time. The hiring environment is really rough right now. There's a lot of people looking for remote jobs if you're really looking for one, so you might have to kind of compromise on that if you're able to. But there's been a lot of layoffs in the tech industry. There's been a lot of layoffs everywhere, honestly. And so it makes it harder to hire people at this point. And it's really hard to break into the industry when there's a lot of people who are unemployed. So just know that it's going to take some time. And I know how it feels when you get rejected from jobs that you really wanted. Don't let it get you too down. There's a lot of great jobs out there for people too. So that's my final thoughts. Thank you for coming to my talk. I guess what we'll do is we'll open for questions because I think there'll probably be quite a few questions here. So if anyone's got any questions, you can throw them up in the Q&A. But the other thing that I want to talk about here is, once again, thank you all for joining and attending my presentation here. I'm just reading through the chat here to see if there's any questions that I did miss too. What in the world are OER bullets or NCOER? Yeah, you guys saw that. But yeah, I will say that I saw those a lot, especially on transitioning veterans ones where it was things like, hey, I went through and changed the light bulb and prevented downtime for a $50 million military installation facility, which is actually, I think, was really creative. And I actually really love that. I did interview that person because I liked that. But it is something that a lot of hiring managers might not necessarily enjoy. Is CISO a good goal to reach as a cybersecurity professional? That is a fantastic question. And in fact, we could do a whole conversation on that, Ron. What I would tell you is that there's a lot that the average turnover time for CISOs at companies is 2 years. So that should help inform you about what do you want to do in this industry. Being a CISO is absolutely a miserable job for a lot of people. It's a job where you can have a lot of impact, but the turnover time is so quick. And a lot of times it's because there's a lot of things outside of, about the same as the SOC analyst, funnily enough. And there's a lot of things that go into it. There's a lot of problems in the security industry, honestly. So I do not blame a lot of the CISOs for when they jump in, they get there, and then they leave. I have spoke as a solutions architect at this point. I speak to a lot of CISOs who are just new to the industry, just new to being a CISO. They are like 6 months in, and then I know in about a year, they're going to be gone. In fact, they're planning for it. A lot of them are talking about how they're planning to move out of CISO. It's actually kind of crazy. As an IT specialist, is that the best route to get into cyber? I'm almost done with the BS in cyber too. Victor, that's a great question. IT specialists were almost automatically, for me, interviews. I saw that they worked in IT. They had some interest. You having done IT before, and then you getting a BS in cybersecurity, that is a fantastic. You're breaking through a lot of the people who don't have any of that experience and don't have any of that stuff there. My advice to you would be go out there and apply with that. You're probably going to get some interviews with that. If you aren't getting as much as you'd like, get a cert. Get a couple of certs if you want to. Get the Security Plus, get your CYSA, and then you will be imminently employable. You will get past that first hurdle of trying to get into that first interview door. After that, I would really recommend practicing your interview, doing mock interviews. I know people in the VetSec community will do mock interviews with you, but I would really recommend practicing your interview skills, practice what you're going to answer, understand what questions they're going to ask and be prepared for them. And you're in a great position though. I will say it is a hard time to get hired in this industry. There's a lot of people without their jobs, so it might take you a little bit longer than in the past, but I have no doubt that you would be able to break into this industry fairly well. Of course, absolutely. Asking from Michael and Brad, am I hiring? No, I am not. I no longer hire for my teams anymore. If I do come across teams that are hiring, and I do come across teams that are hiring quite frequently, I will let you know. But no, it's a good question too. How do you get a CISO job when you're new to the industry? That makes my head spin. I will tell you that is actually far less uncommon than people might think. I will tell you that from my experience, I have seen a lot of CISOs that came in from operational duties and things like that. Some of them are actually really great. Especially if they let the team tell them, hey, this is what we need to do from a security standpoint, and they are the ones who kind of understand it from a risk standpoint. But it happens really frequently. There's a lot of CISOs that I've met who have never done cybersecurity before who are now doing cybersecurity. Does it matter what the questions are? Do we have to ask what the missions, vision, value of the company? Ought we to have researched the company to such a depth that we can ask about a specific project that the company is privately working on? No, neither of those things are necessarily have-to-dos. In fact, what I would tell you is a really great question is, tell me in your own words, what is the mission of your company? Or what is the value of your company? Or even better, what do you most value on your cybersecurity team? Questions like that, one, you're never going to be able to research them by yourself. But two, honestly, it's just a great way to get the manager talking, and they're going to think, hey, that's a great question. I got asked that a couple of times. I like to ask that question. It's just a really good question to ask. And it's something that, you don't have to do all this research up front. There's a lot of people that talk about do a bunch of research up front on these companies and understand all these things in the first place. Don't do that. You don't have to. That's what the interview is for. You can talk about it, know at least who the company is, and maybe a little bit about the position you're interviewing for. But you don't have to know their mission values and have it stamped across your head that, hey, I live all these things. You can ask them about it and have them explain it. So thank you everyone for your time. I really love presenting here, and these were all really great questions. So thank you everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great VetSecCon.